Please, sir, I'll do anything, anything at all. The words came out broken, barely a whisper from cracked lips. The woman's trembling hands clutched a worn piece of paper, a doctor's bill that might as well have been her death sentence. The banker's cold eyes swept over her threadbare dress, her hollow cheeks, the desperation carved into every line of her face. Mrs. Hartford, you've already mortgaged everything you own. There's nothing left. His voice carried the finality of a coffin lid closing. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. Behind her, through the dusty window of Copper Ridge's only bank, her 6-year-old son Tommy sat slumped in their broken-down wagon, his small chest rising and falling with labored breaths. The fever had been consuming him for 3 weeks now, and Doc Peterson had been clear. Without proper medicine from the city, the boy wouldn't see another winter. "There has to be something," she whispered, her voice cracking like drought-parched earth. "He's just a child." The banker leaned back in his leather chair, a predatory smile creeping across his face. "Well, now that you mention it, there might be one arrangement we could discuss. Step into my private office, Mrs. Hartford. I'm sure we can find something mutually beneficial." The way he said those last words made her skin crawl. But as Tommy's weak cough drifted through the window, she felt her resolve crumble like sand through her fingers. She was about to nod, about to follow him into that office and trade away the last piece of her soul, when the bank door burst open with such force it rattled the windows. A mountain of a man filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the harsh afternoon sun. Dust swirled around his boots as his steel-gray eyes took in the scene. The banker's greasy smile, her tears, her obvious desperation. "Ma'am," his deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Looks like you might need some help." What happened next would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. The stranger's presence seemed to suck all the air from the stuffy bank. He stood easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the war world and hands that looked like they could crush stone, or cradle something precious without leaving so much as a mark. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and a jagged scar ran from his left ear to his jaw, telling stories of violence survived. "Mr. McCready," the banker stammered, his predatory confidence evaporating like morning dew. "I didn't expect to see you in town today." The big man's eyes never left Sarah's face. She felt exposed under that steady gaze, as if he could see straight through to her breaking heart. "Mrs. Hartford," she managed, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Sarah Hartford." "Mrs. Hartford." He tipped his worn hat with surprising gentleness for such massive hands. "I'm Jake McCready. Couldn't help but overhear you're in some kind of trouble." The banker cleared his throat nervously. "Now, Jake, this is a private matter between the bank and—" "Wasn't talking to you, Patterson." Jake's voice dropped to a growl that made the banker's face go pale. "Ma'am, would you mind telling me what kind of help you need?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd heard whispers about Jake McCready, how he'd single-handedly fought off a gang of rustlers, how he lived alone on his ranch like some kind of hermit, how his wife had died years ago and left him bitter as winter wind. But looking into his eyes now, she saw something unexpected. Kindness. "My son," she whispered, gesturing toward the window where Tommy lay curled in the wagon. "He's sick, real sick. The doctor says he needs medicine from Denver, but it costs $60 and I—" Her voice broke entirely. $60 might as well have been $600. She'd already sold her wedding ring, her mother's silver brush, everything of value she'd brought west from Ohio when she'd followed her husband's dream of striking it rich in the silver mines. That dream had died with him in a cave-in 6 months ago, leaving her with nothing but debts and a dying child. $60, Jake repeated quietly. He reached into his vest and pulled out a leather wallet, worn smooth by years of use. Without hesitation, he counted out bills onto the banker's desk. Sarah's legs nearly gave out. I can't, I don't have any way to pay you back. Didn't ask you to. Jake's voice was gruff, but his eyes were gentle. Can you cook? I, yes, but can you keep house? Tend a garden? Yes, but Mr. McCready, I don't understand. My ranch could use a woman's touch. Place has been falling apart since... He paused, pain flickering across his weathered features. Since my Mary died. You and your boy need a place to stay. I need help around the spread. Seems like it might work out for both of us. The banker sputtered protests about proper arrangements and moral impropriety, but Jake silenced him with a look that could have frozen hell itself. Sarah stared at this man who'd just offered salvation without asking for anything in return, except honest work. In her experience, men always wanted something more, something she wasn't willing to give. But there was something different about Jake McCready, something solid and trustworthy as granite. Through the window, Tommy coughed again, weaker this time. But Jake McCready might not be offering salvation at all. The ride to McCready's ranch stretched through country so beautiful it almost made Sarah forget her fears. Almost. Jake drove his sturdy wagon with practiced ease, one massive hand holding the reins, while the other remained protectively near the rifle, resting across his knees. Tommy lay bundled in the wagon bed behind them, his fever finally broken thanks to the medicine they'd purchased in town, but still weak as a newborn calf. How long since your husband passed? Jake asked quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon with the wariness of a man who'd learned not to trust peaceful moments. 6 months. Sarah adjusted the blanket around Tommy's sleeping form. Samuel always said Colorado would make our fortune. Guess he was half right. It made someone's fortune, just not ours. The late afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the prairie grass. In the distance, cattle dotted the landscape like scattered brown pebbles, and Sarah could make out the outline of buildings nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees. That's home, Jake said, following her gaze. The ranch house was larger than Sarah had expected, a solid 2-story structure built from local timber, with a wraparound porch and real glass windows that caught the dying light. Outbuildings dotted the property, a massive barn, corrals, a bunkhouse, and what looked like a workshop. It spoke of prosperity earned through hard work, not gotten by cheating widows and orphans. It's beautiful, she breathed. Mary designed it. Jake's voice carried old pain, carefully buried but never forgotten. Always said she wanted a place where a family could grow. He was quiet for a moment. Guess that's not going to happen now. Sarah heard the ache in his words and recognized it, the hollow sound of dreams that died with the people who shared them. How long has it been? 3 years come Christmas. Jake pulled the wagon up to the front porch. Fever took her, same as what was trying to take your boy. Doc Peterson did everything he could, but the medicine she needed... He shrugged, but Sarah could see the guilt and helplessness carved into the lines around his eyes. As Jake helped her down from the wagon, Sarah noticed how careful he was not to touch her more than necessary, how he kept his massive hands gentle and respectful. When he lifted Tommy from the wagon bed, the boy seemed tiny in his arms, fragile as spun glass. Second door on the right upstairs, Jake murmured. That'll be his room. Yours is right next to it. There's a connecting door in case he needs you during the night. The house was immaculate inside, too clean, too orderly, like a museum of a life that used to be lived there. Every surface gleamed with care, but there was no warmth, no lived-in comfort. It was the home of a man who'd given up on living and settled for merely existing. As they climbed the stairs, Sarah noticed the portrait on the landing, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and dark hair pinned up in the style of a few years back. She was standing beside a younger, unmarked version of Jake, both of them smiling like they held the secrets of happiness. That's Mary, Jake said unnecessarily. She was beautiful. Inside and out. He pushed open the bedroom door with his shoulder. This was going to be... He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening. Sarah understood. This was going to be the nursery, the room where Mary McCready would have raised the children they'd planned together. Instead, it had become a shrine to possibilities that would never be. Jake settled Tommy on the narrow bed with surprising tenderness for such a big man. The boy stirred briefly, his fever-bright eyes opening. Where are we, Mama? Safe, Sarah whispered, stroking his damp hair. We're safe now. But as she watched Jake McCready's retreating form in the doorway, something in his rigid posture told her that safety might come at a price she hadn't yet learned to calculate. The next morning revealed just how much Jake McCready had been struggling alone. Sarah woke before dawn, old habits from years of managing a household on her own, and found the kitchen dark and cold. The massive cast-iron stove sat dead and silent, its surface dusty from disuse. The pantry held mostly canned goods and dried beans, the kind of food a man ate when he'd given up on the pleasure of eating and focused only on the necessity. She'd barely gotten a fire started when heavy footsteps sounded on the back porch. Jake appeared in the doorway like a mountain given human form. His hair still damp from washing at the pump outside, his work shirt stretched across shoulders that looked capable of moving boulders. "Didn't expect you to be up yet," he said, pausing awkwardly in his own kitchen, as if he'd forgotten how to share the space. Tommy's fever broke completely during the night. Sarah cracked eggs into the cast-iron skillet, grateful to have something to do with her hands. "He's sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks." Jake nodded, settling his massive frame into a chair at the kitchen table that suddenly looked child-sized beneath him. "Good. That's real good to hear." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sizzle of bacon and the whistle of wind through the eaves. Sarah had cooked for her husband countless mornings, but this felt different, charged with an awareness that made her hands shake slightly as she flipped the eggs. "Haven't had a proper breakfast in—" Jake paused, seeming to count backward through memory. "Long time." "What have you been eating?" "Whatever was easiest. Beans, hardtack. Sometimes I'd ride into town for a meal at the hotel." He watched her move around the kitchen with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Forgot how good it smells, having someone cook in here again." Sarah set a plate in front of him, eggs, bacon, biscuits golden from the oven, and watched his face transform. For just a moment, the hardness melted away, and she glimpsed the man he might have been before grief carved those lines around his eyes. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I believe you just saved my life." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than he'd probably intended. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned back to the stove to hide her confusion. She'd come here desperate, willing to trade anything for her son's life. She hadn't expected kindness, and she certainly hadn't expected this strange fluttering in her chest when Jake McCready looked at her like she was something precious. "I should warn you," Jake said, cutting into his eggs with the methodical precision of a man who'd eaten too many meals alone. "There'll be talk in town. Folks can be particular about proper arrangements." "I don't care what people say." The words came out fiercer than Sarah intended. "My son was dying. You helped us when no one else would. If people want to gossip about that, it says more about them than it does about us." Jake's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You always been this stubborn?" "Samuel used to say I could out-stubborn a Missouri mule when I set my mind to something." Sarah poured coffee into 2 cups, the mundane domestic task feeling strange and intimate in the morning light. "Of course, he usually said it when I was doing something he didn't like." "What kind of things?" "Learning to shoot, for one." Sarah set his coffee beside his plate. "He thought it wasn't ladylike. I thought it wasn't smart to live out here without knowing how to defend yourself." Something flickered in Jake's eyes, approval, maybe, or surprise. "Can you hit what you aim at?" "My father taught me before I married, said a woman needed to know how to protect what mattered to her." Sarah's voice grew quiet. "Wish I'd been able to protect Samuel." "Mind cave-ins happen fast," Jake said gently. "Nothing anyone could do would have changed that." He was right, but the guilt still lived in her chest like a physical weight. If she'd been stronger, pushed harder for them to stay in Ohio, maybe Samuel would still be alive. Maybe Tommy would never have gotten sick. Maybe she wouldn't be sitting in a stranger's kitchen, accepting charity from a man whose kindness felt too good to be true. But when Jake McCready looked at her across that kitchen table, something in his expression told her he understood guilt intimately, and that understanding might be more dangerous than his charity. By the 3rd day, Sarah had discovered Jake McCready's greatest weakness. He couldn't say no to her son. Tommy had recovered enough to explore, and despite his small size and lingering weakness, he'd attached himself to Jake like a shadow. The big rancher bore this attention with the patience of a saint, answering endless questions about cattle and horses, and the mountain peaks that ring the valley. Can I help feed the chickens, Mr. Jake? Can you teach me to ride? Why do cows make that noise? What's that bird called? Sarah watched from the kitchen window as Jake knelt in the dirt to show Tommy how to hold corn for the chickens, his massive hands covering her son's tiny ones with infinite care. The sight did something strange to her heart, made it beat in a rhythm she'd almost forgotten. He's good with children, she murmured to herself, then froze as she realized the implications of that thought. She was still standing at the window when Jake looked up and caught her watching. For a moment, their eyes held across the yard, and Sarah felt that same electric awareness that had been building between them since she'd arrived. Then Tommy tugged on Jake's sleeve, breaking the spell. That evening, after Tommy had been tucked into bed with a belly full of Sarah's chicken and dumplings, she found Jake on the front porch, staring out at the stars. He'd shed his work shirt in the day's heat, and moonlight gleamed on the sweat-damp skin of his shoulders and arms. Sarah tried not to notice how the muscles moved beneath that skin, tried not to think about what those powerful hands might feel like. "Beautiful night," she said, settling into the rocking chair beside his. "Always is out here." Jake's voice was quiet, contemplative. "One thing I never get tired of, watching those stars come out." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, cattle lowing in the distance, an owl calling from the cottonwoods, the whisper of wind through the grass. It was peaceful in a way Sarah hadn't experienced since before Samuel died, the kind of peace that made you believe the world might not be entirely harsh and unforgiving. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said finally. Jake nodded. "Why did you help us? Really, I mean, you don't know anything about me. I could be a thief or a murderer or... Are you?" "No, but that's not the point. You couldn't have known that." Jake was quiet for so long Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. "Day Mary died, I was in town picking up supplies. Could have been home, should have been home, but I'd gotten into an argument with Patterson about the mortgage payments, and I needed time to cool off before I said something I'd regret." He stared out at the darkness. "By the time I got back, she was burning up with fever, delirious, calling for me." Sarah's heart clenched. She could picture it, Jake riding home to find the woman he loved dying, alone and afraid. "Doc Peterson said if we'd caught it earlier, if we'd gotten the right medicine." Jake's hands clenched on the porch railing. "I failed her. When she needed me most, I wasn't there. Jake, when I saw you in that bank, when I heard your boy coughing in that wagon..." He turned to look at her, and Sarah saw the raw honesty in his eyes. "I couldn't fail again. Couldn't let another woman lose what mattered most because of money." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross. Sarah understood now why Jake had helped her. Not out of charity or kindness, but out of his own desperate need to atone for a failure that existed only in his grief-stricken mind. "Your wife's death wasn't your fault," she said softly. "Maybe not, but I can live with myself better knowing I helped you save your boy." Sarah reached across the space between their chairs and touched his hand. Just a gentle brush of fingers, but it sent heat shooting up her arm like lightning. Jake went very still, as if her touch might burn him. "Thank you," she whispered. But in the darkness beyond the porch, something moved in the shadows, something that suggested their peaceful evening was about to come to an abrupt and dangerous end. The visitor arrived at dawn with trouble written in every line of his expensive Eastern suit. Sarah was hanging laundry when she spotted the black carriage winding its way up the ranch road, driven by a man whose pale, soft hands had never known honest work. Even at a distance, she could see the gold watch chain glinting across his vest and the calculating way his eyes surveyed Jake's property like he was appraising it for purchase. "Jake," she called, but he was already striding across the yard from the barn, his rifle held loose but ready in his hands. The carriage rolled to a stop near the front porch, and the stranger stepped down with the careful movements of a man unused to uncertain footing. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair slicked back with pomade and a thin mustache that gave him the look of a riverboat gambler. But it was his smile that made Sarah's blood run cold, the predatory grin of a man who enjoyed other people's misfortune. "Mr. McCready, I presume?" The stranger's voice carried the crisp consonants of Boston or New York. "My name is Aldrich Whitmore. I believe you know my associate, Mr. Patterson, from the bank in town." Jake's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Whitmore?" "Straight to business. I like that in a man." Whitmore's gaze swept over the ranch buildings, the cattle in the near pasture, and finally settled on Sarah with an interest that made her skin crawl. "I'm here about a debt, Mr. McCready. Seems your house guest has some outstanding obligations." "I don't owe anyone anything," Sarah said, stepping closer to Jake's solid presence. Whitmore's smile widened. "Oh, but you do, my dear Mrs. Hartford. Your late husband borrowed quite extensively against his mining claim, money that was never repaid. The debt has been purchased by my consortium, along with full collection rights. Samuel never borrowed money from anyone but the local bank. Perhaps not directly, but he did sign several promissory notes, $500 worth to be precise, all properly witnessed and notarized." Whitmore reached into his jacket and produced a sheaf of official-looking papers. "I have the documents right here." Sarah's legs nearly buckled. $500 might as well have been 5,000, an impossible sum that would keep her in debt for the rest of her life. Jake stepped between her and Whitmore, his massive frame blocking the man's view of her face. "Lot of forgeries floating around these days. Funny how they always seem to show up after folks are dead and can't dispute them. I assure you, these documents are completely legitimate." Whitmore's tone remained pleasant, but steel crept into his voice. "Mrs. Hartford can settle the debt in cash, of course. Or—" His gaze slid past Jake to rest on Sarah again. "There are other arrangements that might be mutually beneficial." The way he said it made Sarah feel like something unclean was crawling over her skin. She'd heard whispers about men like Whitmore, Eastern vultures who preyed on widows and orphans, who created debts out of thin air and collected them through intimidation, or worse. "Get off my land," Jake growled, raising his rifle to a more threatening angle. "Now, Mr. McCready, there's no need for hostility. I'm simply here to collect what's owed." Whitmore adjusted his sleeve cuffs with elaborate casualness. "Of course, if Mrs. Hartford can't pay, we might be forced to pursue other avenues. Garnish wages, seize property, or perhaps arrange for her to work off the debt in my employ." "What kind of employment?" Sarah forced the words past her constricted throat. Whitmore's smile was answer enough. "The kind of employment that would destroy what was left of her soul and leave Tommy truly orphaned." "You're not taking her anywhere," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, Mr. McCready, unless, of course, you'd like to settle the debt yourself. $500 is a reasonable price for such attractive collateral." Jake's knuckles went white on the rifle stock. For a moment, Sarah thought he might pull the trigger, and part of her wished he would, but murder would solve nothing and create more problems than it solved. "I'll need time to examine those documents," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Make sure they're legitimate." "Of course, I'm staying at the hotel in town. You have 3 days to make arrangements, Mrs. Hartford. After that—" Whitmore climbed back into his carriage. "Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that." As the carriage rolled away, Jake lowered his rifle but kept his eyes on the dust cloud until it disappeared over the ridge. "Those papers real?" he asked quietly. Sarah stared at the documents Whitmore had left on the porch railing, her heart hammering against her ribs. Even from here, she could see Samuel's signature at the bottom of each page, or what looked like his signature. But something about those signatures made her blood freeze in her veins. The signatures were wrong, but proving it would require a trip to the one place Sarah had hoped never to return. She sat at Jake's kitchen table with the forged documents spread before her hands trembling as she traced the familiar loops and curves of her dead husband's handwriting, or what purported to be his handwriting. To anyone else, the signatures looked perfect, but Sarah had watched Samuel write thousands of letters, had seen him struggle with the arthritis that had gradually crippled his left hand over their 5 years of marriage. "These were supposedly signed 6 months ago," she said, pointing to the dates. "But look at the S in Samuel. See how straight and confident it is?" Jake leaned over her shoulder, his presence warm and solid behind her chair. "Looks right to me." "Samuel broke his left wrist in a mining accident 8 months ago. It never healed properly. After that, his handwriting changed, became more cramped, hesitant. The S developed this little tremor at the beginning. Sarah pulled out the last letter Samuel had written to his brother in Ohio, comparing the two signatures. These papers show no sign of that injury. Jake's breath stirred her hair as he examined the documents. Whitmore's clever. Probably used old examples of your husband's writing to forge these. We need to prove it, but the only person who witnessed all of Samuel's business dealings was his partner, Frank Morrison. Sarah's stomach knotted with dread. Frank owns the Paradise Saloon now, bought it with his share of the mine proceeds after Samuel died. You think he'd help us? Sarah's laugh held no humor. Frank Morrison proposed to me at Samuel's funeral. When I turned him down, he made it clear he thought I was being foolishly high and mighty for a woman with no prospects. She folded the forged documents with careful precision. He's not going to help us out of the kindness of his heart. Then we'll have to convince him some other way. The iron determination in Jake's voice made Sarah look up at him. Jake, you can't threaten him. Frank's got friends in town, connections. If you make an enemy of him, I've made enemies before. Jake's scarred face was grim. Won't lose sleep over making one more if it keeps you safe. The casual way he said it, keeps you safe, sent a warm flutter through Sarah's chest. When was the last time anyone had cared about keeping her safe? When had anyone been willing to make enemies on her behalf? There might be another way, she said slowly. Frank always fancied himself a gambling man. What if we could get him to bet on something? Winner takes all? What kind of bet? I don't know yet, but Frank's got a weak spot for proving he's better than other men. If we could challenge his pride somehow. Sarah stood and began pacing the kitchen, her mind racing. He used to brag about being the best shot in Copper Ridge, the best rider, the best poker player. Samuel always said Frank's ego would be his downfall someday. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. What if the bet was about you? What do you mean? Frank thinks he should have been the one to take you in, right? Probably figures I'm just some lonely fool who got played by a pretty face. Jake's voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught the slight flush on his neck. What if we let him think that's exactly what happened? Sarah felt heat rise in her own cheeks. I don't understand. We go to town, let folks see us together. Really together, like a couple. Maybe Frank gets jealous enough to do something stupid. Challenge me to some kind of contest with you as the prize. The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to examine. The idea of pretending to be Jake's woman, of letting him touch her and hold her where others could see. It could work, Sarah said quietly. But Jake, if we do this, if we convince people we're involved, there'll be talk. Your reputation, don't care about my reputation. You should. You have to live in this town long after I'm gone. Jake's eyes snapped to hers, something fierce and protective flashing in their gray depths. Who says you're going anywhere? The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd been thinking of this arrangement as temporary, a safe harbor, while she figured out how to rebuild her life. But the way Jake was looking at her now, like the idea of her leaving, was physically painful. I can't stay here forever, she whispered. Why not? Before Sarah could answer, Tommy's voice drifted down from upstairs, weak and frightened, calling for her. By the time she'd checked on him and assured herself he was only having a bad dream, the moment had passed. But Jake's question echoed in her mind as she tucked her son back into bed. Why couldn't she stay here forever? And more troubling still, why was she starting to want to? The plan went wrong the moment they walked into the Paradise Saloon. Sarah had dressed carefully for their performance. Her best blue dress, the one that brought out her eyes and showed just enough décolletage to be interesting without being improper. Jake walked beside her with one possessive hand resting on the small of her back, playing his part as the smitten rancher to perfection. But the moment Frank Morrison looked up from behind the bar, Sarah knew they'd miscalculated. His eyes went dark with something that wasn't just jealousy, it was rage, pure and simple. Well, well, Frank called out, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet saloon. Look what the wind blew in. Jake McCready and his pretty little charity case. The insult hit its mark. Sarah felt Jake's hand tense against her back, felt the subtle shift in his posture that meant trouble. But before she could intervene, Frank was coming around the bar with the swagger of a man who'd been drinking his own courage. Heard you took in poor Samuel's widow, Frank continued, his gaze raking over Sarah in a way that made her skin crawl. Real Christian of you, Jake. Though I wonder what kind of gratitude she's been showing you. Watch your mouth, Morrison. Jake's voice was deadly quiet. Or what? You'll shoot me down like some common outlaw? Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. Folks around here know what kind of man you are, McCready. Know about that temper of yours. Tell me, Sarah, he's shown you those scars on his hands yet? The ones from beating his last hired man half to death? Sarah's blood went cold. She looked up at Jake's face, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his eyes had gone flat and dangerous. But she also saw something else. Shame. That man was stealing from me, Jake said quietly, and he put his hands on Mary. So you say, but there's only your word for it, isn't there? Just like there's only your word that you're not taking advantage of poor Sarah here. Frank's smile was ugly. Course, I suppose a desperate woman can't be too choosy. Even a killer's better than no protection at all. Jake started forward, but Sarah caught his arm. Don't, she whispered. He's trying to provoke you. But the damage was already done. She could see it in the faces of the other patrons. The doubt, the suspicion. These people had accepted Jake McCready as a member of their community, but they'd never quite forgotten what lay beneath his civilized veneer. Frank's words had reminded them that Jake was dangerous, that maybe they should be asking harder questions about the arrangement between him and the pretty widow. Tell you what, McCready, Frank said, emboldened by the crowd's reaction. I'm feeling generous tonight. How about we settle this like gentlemen? Winner gets the woman. I'm not some prize to be won, Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. Aren't you, though? Frank's gaze settled on her with possessive intensity. You need a man's protection, a man's name. Question is, which man has the better claim? The one who knew your husband and could have helped you proper-like? Or the killer who swooped in when you were desperate enough to accept charity from anyone? The worst part was, he wasn't entirely wrong. Sarah had been desperate enough to accept help from a stranger, desperate enough to make an arrangement that put her reputation at risk. But Jake wasn't a killer, at least not the kind Frank was implying. What kind of contest? Jake asked, his voice carefully controlled. Sarah's heart sank. He was actually considering it. Poker, Frank said immediately. Card draw, winner takes all. If you win, I'll tell everyone what really happened with those promissory notes. If I win, his smile was predatory. Well, Sarah comes to work for me. I'll take real good care of her. Jake, no. Sarah turned to face him fully. This is insane. I won't be gambled away like a poker chip. But Jake wasn't looking at her. His attention was fixed on Frank with the intensity of a hunter sizing up dangerous prey. What happens to the boy? Tommy stays with me either way, Sarah said quickly. That's not negotiable. Frank shrugged. Fine by me. Could use a boy around the place to sweep floors and empty spittoons. The casual way he dismissed Tommy's future made Sarah's blood boil, but before she could voice her outrage, Jake spoke. One hand, he said, winner takes all. And Sarah realized with growing horror that Jake McCready might not be the safe harbor she'd thought him to be, after all. The cards were dealt at midnight in the back room of the Paradise Saloon, with half the town crowded around to witness the game that would decide Sarah Hartford's fate. She sat in the corner with Tommy sleeping against her shoulder, watching two men gamble over her future like she was a piece of property to be won or lost. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was insane, that she should grab her son and run before either man could claim victory. But where would she go? Whitmore would find her eventually, and without Jake's protection. 5-card draw, no limit, Frank announced, shuffling the deck with theatrical flourish. Winner takes the woman and all her debts. Agreed? Jake nodded curtly, his massive hands steady as granite as he cut the cards. If he was nervous, it didn't show. But then again, Sarah was learning that Jake McCready was very good at hiding what he felt. The crowd pressed closer as Frank dealt the pin. Sarah caught glimpses of faces in the lamplight. Doc Peterson looking uncomfortable but fascinated. Patterson from the bank sweating despite the cool night air. Half a dozen ranch hands and townspeople who'd never seen a woman wagered over a poker table. Jake picked up his cards with the same calm precision he brought to everything else. His expression revealed nothing as he examined his hand, arranged the cards, and set them face down on the scarred wooden table. "I'll stand," he said simply. Frank's eyebrows rose. "No draw? Confident, aren't you?" "Play your hand, Morrison." Frank studied his cards with exaggerated care, his forehead creasing in concentration. Finally, he discarded 2 cards and drew replacements from the deck. "2 cards," he announced to the room. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd never been a gambling woman. Samuel had always said poker was a fool's game, but even she knew that a man who took no cards was either bluffing spectacularly or holding something very special. "Call," Frank said, tossing chips into the center of the table. Jake matched the bet without hesitation. "You first." Frank spread his cards with a triumphant grin. 3 sevens. The crowd murmured appreciatively. It was a solid hand, good enough to win most pots. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. 3 of a kind was hard to beat. If Jake had been bluffing— "Full house," Jake said quietly, laying down his cards. "Kings over 8s." The room exploded in noise. Frank's face went white, then red, his hands trembling as he stared at the cards that had just cost him everything he'd wagered. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You didn't even draw—" "Didn't need to." Jake's voice was matter-of-fact as he gathered his winnings. "Now about those promissory notes." Frank's composure cracked completely. "You cheated. You had to have cheated." "Now, Frank," Doc Peterson stepped forward, his voice diplomatically soothing. "We all saw Jake cut the cards and you dealt them yourself. Hard to cheat under those circumstances." "He's been planning this. Him and that woman. They set me up." Frank's voice rose to a shout. "I won't be taken by some scheming—" The accusation died in his throat as Jake rose from his chair. The big rancher didn't make any threatening moves, didn't raise his voice or clench his fists. He simply stood there, all 6.5 feet of him, and let Frank remember exactly who he was dealing with. "The notes, Morrison," Jake said quietly. Frank's hands shook as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. "Samuel Hartford came to me last spring, desperate for money to buy new equipment. Said his wife didn't need to know about the loan. I have his marker right here." Jake unfolded the paper and examined it carefully. After a moment, he looked up with something that might have been amusement. "This is your handwriting, Frank, all of it." "What are you talking about?" "Samuel Hartford couldn't write worth a damn after he broke his wrist. But this signature's too neat, too confident. You wrote the whole thing yourself, didn't you? Figured with Samuel dead, no one would ever know the difference." Frank's face went gray. "That's not— I never— Course, forgery's a hanging offense in these parts." Jake's voice remained conversational. "Might be worth mentioning to Sheriff Williams next time he comes through town." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Frank looked around the room, seeking support from the faces that had been friendly an hour before. He found only suspicion and disgust. "You can't prove anything," he said desperately. "Don't have to. Folks can draw their own conclusions." Jake folded the forged document carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. "But I believe you owe Mrs. Hartford an apology, and a promise that she won't be bothered by any more mysterious debts." Frank's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Finally, he managed— There might have been some mistake about those notes. Could be they weren't entirely accurate." "Could be," Jake agreed mildly. "Sarah?" But as Sarah rose to accept Frank's humiliated apology, she caught sight of a familiar figure in the crowd. Aldrich Whitmore, watching the proceedings with calculating eyes and a smile that promised this victory might be more temporary than Jake believed. Whitmore struck back 3 days later, and this time he brought the law with him. Sarah was hanging laundry in the ranch yard when she spotted the dust cloud approaching from town, 2 riders this time, moving at a purposeful pace that made her stomach clench with dread. She called for Jake, but he was in the far pasture repairing fence and wouldn't hear her over the wind. The riders resolved into Whitmore and a man wearing a deputy's badge, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. Sarah recognized him, Dave Henley, a mean-spirited bully who'd somehow talked his way into a position of authority. The kind of man who enjoyed using his badge to settle personal scores. "Mrs. Hartford," Whitmore called out as they dismounted. "I believe you know Deputy Henley." "Ma'am," Henley touched his hat brim with mock courtesy. "Afraid I'm here on official business." Sarah's mouth went dry. "What kind of business?" "Theft," Henley said, pulling a folded warrant from his pocket. "Got a complaint says you've been living here under false pretenses, taking money and goods from Mr. McCready under fraudulent circumstances." "That's ridiculous. Jake offered me honest work." "Did he now?" Whitmore's smile was cold as winter wind. "Funny thing about honest work, usually involves some kind of honest labor, but from what folks in town are saying, you've been playing house with Mr. McCready, enjoying all the benefits of marriage without any of the responsibilities." Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks. "My arrangements with Jake are none of your business." "Afraid they are now," Henley said. "See, fraud's a crime in this territory, and a woman who takes a man's money and shelter under false pretenses." He shrugged. "Well, that's theft, plain and simple." "Where is McCready?" Whitmore asked, his gaze sweeping the ranch buildings. "Seems like he should be here to defend his investment." Tommy chose that moment to come running around the corner of the house, his face bright with excitement. "Mama, Mr. Jake taught me how to milk the cow, and she licked my hand and—" He stopped abruptly when he saw the strangers, instinctively moving closer to Sarah's side. She put a protective arm around him, her mind racing. If they arrested her, what would happen to Tommy? Would he end up in an orphanage or worse? "Cute boy," Whitmore observed. "Be a shame if he had to grow up without his mother. Course, we might be able to work out an arrangement." The implication in his voice made Sarah's blood freeze. She'd heard stories about men like Whitmore, about the kind of arrangements they made with desperate women. "I'll need you to come with me, ma'am," Henley said, his hand moving closer to his gun. "You can pack a small bag, but make it quick." "You can't just take her," Tommy's voice was high and frightened. "She didn't steal nothing." "Hush, sweetie," Sarah whispered, her mind spinning desperately. There had to be something she could do, some way to fight this. The warrant looked official, but she'd learned not to trust documents that seemed too convenient. "Actually," she said slowly, "I think you might want to check the date on that warrant, Deputy." Henley frowned. "What about it?" "It's dated 3 days ago, but the alleged crime, me taking shelter here under false pretenses, that would have happened when I first arrived, wouldn't it?" Sarah kept her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "Yet you're claiming I defrauded Jake by accepting his offer of honest work. How could you swear out a warrant for fraud before you knew whether I'd actually done the work I promised?" Whitmore's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're stalling. I'm asking legitimate questions about a legal document that doesn't make sense." Sarah held Henley's gaze. "Unless, of course, this whole thing was planned in advance. Unless someone decided I was guilty before I'd even had a chance to prove my innocence." Henley's face flushed red. "You calling me dishonest?" "I'm saying that warrant looks like it was written by someone who already knew what conclusion they wanted to reach." Sarah's voice grew stronger. "And in my experience, that's not how justice is supposed to work." "Enough!" Whitmore snapped. "Deputy, arrest her now before—" The sharp crack of a rifle being cocked echoed across the yard. All 3 adults turned to see Jake McCready standing 20 feet away, his Winchester trained on Henley's chest. "Gentlemen, Jake said quietly, "I believe you are trespassing on my property." But the cold look in Jake's eyes suggested that trespassing was the least of their worries. The standoff lasted exactly 10 seconds before Jake did something that changed everything. "Tommy," he said, never taking his eyes off Henley and Whitmore, "go inside and get that wooden box from the top shelf of my bedroom wardrobe. The one with the brass corners." Tommy hesitated, looking between his mother and the gun-wielding men in their yard. "But Mama—" "Do what Mr. Jake says, sweetie," Sarah said quietly. "Everything's going to be fine." As Tommy ran toward the house, Jake took several steps closer, his rifle still trained on the deputy. Now then, gentlemen, and let's talk about that warrant. You're interfering with official business, McCready, Henley blustered, but his hand had moved well away from his gun. That's a crime. So's falsifying legal documents. Jake's voice was conversational, but there was steel underneath. Funny thing about warrants, deputy, they have to be issued by a judge. And Judge Morrison's been laid up with pneumonia for the past 2 weeks. Everyone in town knows that. Whitmore's face went pale. The warrant is perfectly legal. Is it? Jake shifted his aim slightly, now covering both men. Because last I heard, Judge Morrison's the only man in this county with authority to issue arrest warrants. His signature's on every legal document that comes through here. He smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Of course, I suppose you could ride back to town and check with his clerk. Mrs. Morrison keeps real careful records of what her husband signs and when. Sarah felt a surge of hope. If Jake was right, if the warrant was forged. You're bluffing, Henley said, but he sounded less certain now. Am I? Jake's gray eyes were cold as winter stone. Tell you what, why don't we all ride into town together? Have Doc Peterson take a look at that signature while Judge Morrison's conscious. I'm sure he'll be real interested to know someone's been using his name without permission. Tommy came running back with the wooden box clutched in his arms. Jake nodded towards Sarah. Open it up, Mrs. Hartford. Show our guests what's inside. Sarah lifted the brass-cornered lid with trembling hands. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a collection of official documents, land deeds, contracts, correspondence. But what caught her attention was a letter bearing the official seal of the territorial government. Read the top letter out loud, Jake instructed. Sarah's voice shook as she read, To Captain Jake McCready, in recognition of your service as territorial marshal during the cleanup of the Deadwood gang. She looked up in shock. Jake, you're a lawman? Was, Jake corrected. Retired 3 years ago when Mary got sick. But the commission's still valid. His smile turned predatory. Which means I have full authority to arrest anyone attempting fraud in my jurisdiction. Henley's face went white as fresh snow. Now hold on, McCready. Captain McCready, Jake corrected mildly. And I believe I asked you a question about that warrant signature. You want to keep claiming Judge Morrison signed it, knowing I can verify that signature within the hour? The deputy's bluster collapsed completely. There might have been some irregularities in the paperwork. Might have been? Jake's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. Deputy, you just attempted to arrest an innocent woman on the basis of forged documents? That's conspiracy to commit kidnapping, abuse of authority, and fraud. Any one of those charges could get you 5 years in territorial prison. It wasn't my idea, Henley's voice cracked. Whitmore paid me to... Shut up, you fool, Whitmore snarled. But it was too late. Jake's attention shifted to the Easter man with laser focus. Paid you to what exactly, Mr. Whitmore? Kidnap Mrs. Hartford so you could collect on debts that don't exist? Force her into some kind of employment arrangement? Whitmore's composure finally cracked. You don't understand what you're dealing with, McCready. I have connections, powerful friends who don't care. Jake's rifle never wavered. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back on your horse and ride out of my territory. You're going to tear up whatever fake documents you've got claiming Mrs. Hartford owes you money. And you're never going to come near her or her boy again. And if I refuse, Jake's smile was sharp as a blade. Then I arrest you both, and you can explain to a territorial judge why you thought forging warrants was a good idea. Of course, territorial judges take a dim view of men who prey on widows and orphans. Might be you don't see freedom again for a very long time. Whitmore looked from Jake's rifle to Sarah's protective stance over Tommy, calculating odds that were no longer in his favor. Finally, he turned toward his horse. This isn't over, he said quietly. Yes, Jake replied. It is. But as Sarah watched the two men ride away, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's hidden past might have solved one problem, only to create an even bigger one. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same kitchen where she'd first cooked breakfast for Jake McCready. But everything had changed, including her. The wedding had been small, held in the ranch house parlor with Doc Peterson officiating and Tommy serving as ring bearer. Most of Copper Ridge had attended, curious to see the former territorial marshal marry the widow he'd saved from Aldrich Whitmore's schemes. There had been whispers, of course. There always were when a woman moved from desperate circumstances to security so quickly. But the whispers faded when folks saw how Jake looked at his new wife, like she was a miracle he couldn't quite believe was real. Now Sarah wore his ring on her finger and his name as her own. But more than that, she wore the confidence of a woman who'd learned she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. The woman who'd been prepared to sell herself to save her son had discovered she could forge warrants, outwit corrupt officials, and stand up to predators with nothing but her wits and Jake's steadfast support. "Mama, can I help with the bread?" Tommy asked, bouncing on his toes beside the kitchen table. He'd grown 3 inches since their arrival, his cheeks finally full and rosy with health. More importantly, he'd learned to trust again, to believe that the good things in his life wouldn't be snatched away without warning. "Of course, sweetheart," Sarah smiled, handing him a small piece of dough to knead. "But wash your hands first. You know how particular Mr. Jake is about clean hands in his kitchen." "Our kitchen," Jake's deep voice rumbled from the doorway. He leaned against the frame, still wearing his work clothes from the morning chores, watching his wife and stepson with an expression of quiet contentment. Sarah felt the familiar flutter in her chest that Jake's presence always caused. 6 months of marriage hadn't dimmed the awareness between them. If anything, it had grown stronger. But now it was tempered with something deeper: trust, respect, and a love that had grown gradually from desperate circumstances into something solid and lasting. "Any word from Sheriff Williams about Whitmore?" she asked, though she was pretty sure she knew the answer. "Trial's next month in Denver," Jake said, settling into his chair at the table that had become the heart of their home. "Henley's testimony should put him away for a long time. Turns out we weren't the only folks he tried to swindle with fake documents." Sarah nodded, kneading her bread with perhaps more force than necessary. Justice would be served, but she'd learned not to depend on it for her peace of mind. What mattered was the life they were building here: honest work, steady love, and the knowledge that they'd chosen each other not from desperation, but from recognition of what they could be together. "There's something else," Jake said quietly, reaching into his shirt pocket. "Got a letter from the territorial governor today." Sarah's hand stilled on the bread dough. "What kind of letter?" "Seems there's been some trouble down in New Mexico territory. Cattle rustlers, corrupt officials, the usual problems. They want me to come out of retirement, take on a marshal's commission for 6 months or so." Jake's eyes met hers across the table. "I told them I'd have to discuss it with my family first." The old Sarah, the desperate widow who'd been grateful for any shelter, might have agreed immediately, afraid to ask for more than she'd already been given. But the new Sarah, the woman who'd learned her own worth through Jake's unwavering respect, had different thoughts. "Would we go with you?" she asked. "If you wanted, or I could refuse the commission entirely. My deputy days don't have to come before my husband days." Jake's voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. He'd loved his work as a lawman, had given it up only when Mary's illness demanded his full attention. Now he was being offered a chance to serve again, but not at the cost of the family they'd built. Sarah looked at Tommy, who was listening with the bright interest of a boy who thought adventure sounded exciting. She thought about the ranch, about the community that had slowly come to accept her as Jake's wife rather than his charity case. She thought about the life they'd fought to build and protect. "New Mexico might be nice," she said finally. "I hear it's beautiful country, and Tommy's never seen real mountains." Jake's smile was worth every risk they might face. "You sure?" "I married a lawman," Sarah replied, reaching across the table to cover his scarred hands with hers. "For better or worse, remember? Besides, someone has to keep you fed properly while you're out there making the territory safe for decent folks." As Jake pulled her into his arms, Sarah reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. A year ago, she'd been a desperate woman prepared to sacrifice everything for her son's survival. Now she was a marshal's wife, ready to face new adventures with a man who'd proven that strength and gentleness could coexist in the same heart. The bread would have to wait. Some moments were more important than baking. Outside the kitchen window, the mountains stood eternal against the evening sky, and Sarah McCready knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as partners as equals, and as two people who'd learned that the best kind of love is the kind that grows from respect, trust, and the daily choice to stand by each other no matter what storms might come. Love, she discovered, wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you built, day by day, with steady hands and faithful hearts. And she and Jake McCready were very good builders indeed. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the Wild West. If this story touched your heart or kept you on the edge of your seat, I'd be forever grateful if you'd share your thoughts in the comments below. Which moment made you hold your breath? What did you think of Sarah and Jake's love story? And most importantly, where should we adventure next? Your support means everything to this storyteller's heart. So please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more tales of love, courage, and hope. Until our paths cross again, may your own story be filled with the kind of love that conquers all odds.